this is an interesting interview I just found by William F. Buckley with F.A. Hayek and a guy named Roach. And I think it's got a lot of great stuff in it. There's a lot of economics in terms of income redistribution, which they make, I think, some great arguments as to why it's not appropriate to tax people to create income and to create equality. I think the whole notion of social justice is important to talk about from the 6th District or from a learning community. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Let me just point out one religious thing that came up by Roach at the Hillsdale College, and that is he says that it's wrong to force people to give up income in order to help other people. But then I would say it's also then wrong for anyone to force anybody into their moral beliefs in terms of religion, in terms of Christianity. So I think that if you go down the path of choice and freedom, then you have to divorce the concept of a moral good across the community. I know that wasn't very articulate. Let me try to say it a little differently in terms of what he said. It's okay, he says, for an individual to give charity, but it's not okay for the government to tax somebody to give charity, which I think makes perfect sense. But then it's also okay for an individual to believe in a creator and in Christianity, but it's not okay for the government to force others to have that same belief. And so I think that's important. He uses the word utilitarian as being a bad thing. But if I'm a utilitarian, I see nothing wrong with that. So I'd like to talk more about that in our discussions. Thank you.
We have two guests. George Roach is the president of Hillsdale College in Michigan, a venerable small coeducational institute unabashedly devoted to the cultivation of the moral imagination and the presumption in favor of the private sector. Our second guest is the senior libertarian economist in the world, Nobel laureate Friedrich von Hayek. Mr. Hayek, you wrote a very famous essay on the intellectuals and socialism, in which you attempted, I think quite successfully, to show why socialism is so nubile for the intellectuals. What is that thesis of yours, and do you still defend it?
Certainly, yes. Well, it's a very interesting story intellectually. One of the dominant ideas which governs thinking since the 18th century is the idea that we can make everything to our pleasure, that we can design social institutions in their working. Now, that is basically mistaken. Social institutions have never been designed and do much more than we know. They have grown up by a process of selection of the successful without people frequently know why it was successful. That applies to the market. The market is I was going to say most ingenious, but ingenious without having been designed, instrument which enables us to utilize knowledge which is distributed among hundreds and thousands of people. It's an adaptation to thousands of circumstances which nobody ever can know as a whole, and where the prices formed on the market tell the individual what to do and what not to do in the social interest. Now, in order to understand this, you have to know economics. To the naive person who imagines all the distribution of income is determined by somebody deliberately and actively, it seems that if this is the responsibility of a particular guide, this is evidently done very unjustly. The fact is, it's not being done unjustly because we achieve all that we do achieve by having come to agree to play a sort of game in which the game of the market, as I likely to call it, in which, because we are utilizing more information, more facts than anybody knows, the outcome for a particular individual is necessarily unpredictable. Now, an outcome which is unpredictable and undesigned by anybody cannot be just. Just as little as the outcome of a game of chance can be a just game. But people resent this. And the people who imagine, oh, it should be possible to design all this, to arrange this, accept the government to do this in a manner that the distribution is just. Now, that is literally impossible, because it would require that all this widely dispersed information about particular facts and particular circumstances and particular gifts can be used and controlled by a central authority.
Why couldn't the role of the justice maker come at the end of a process by taking from someone who has more than he needs for the purpose of satisfying somebody who has less than he needs?
Because if he knows that part of his income is going to be taken for him, there's no inducement for him to do that particular thing. If I know that if I do a thing which will fetch a very high price, 2/3 of it are being taken from me, and I can do something much more pleasant for 1/3 of the income without paying any income tax, I'm going to do that and not going to do what's most beneficial to society.
Well, but in point of fact, a great many people who are taxed at the 2/3 rate continue to be very productive.
Well, I doubt whether they are as productive as they could be.
All right, but let's say they are less productive than they could be. But how do you answer the question that the demands of justice are perhaps approached after you have permitted a natural distribution of the proceeds through the market mechanism?
There are no possible rules of a just distribution in a system where the distribution is not deliberately the result of people bringing it about. I mean, justice is an attribute of individual action. I can be just or unjust towards my fellow man. But the conception of a social justice, to expect from an impersonal process which nobody can control to bring about a just result, is not only a meaningless conception, it's completely impossible. See, everybody talks about social justice, but if you press people to explain to you what they mean by social justice, what they would accept as just, nobody knows. I'm telling you because I've been trying for the past 20 years, asking people, what really are your principles of social justice?
Is it your notion that a society ought not to undertake redistribution because it cannot define justice, or because it has no legitimate authority to engage in the act of redistribution?
Both, as a matter of fact. It occurs to me that such a thing as social justice becomes almost a contradiction in terms, because if you examine the philosophic roots that produced the modern egalitarian ideal, those roots contain all sorts of departures from the idea that it is possible to establish a difference between right and wrong. They deny the operation of a moral framework and ultimately come to the utilitarian goal that all ideas and all values are to be considered essentially on their own merits. And the same people who have said that and are busy then undercutting the more traditional values in Western civilization are the same people who then go on and prate about social justice as though somehow the assignment of numbers, of quantification, will tell us something about justice, and in fact it will not. So I don't think that you can define social justice. You can define social injustice. You can produce a socially unjust situation, but to do so, what you've really done is undercut individual morality and the opportunity to make those choices that have genuine moral content.
Suppose you have a state in which extreme conditions exist. In one area of the state, $50 a year is spent towards the education of a child. in the other end of the state, $1,000 per year is spent towards the education of the child. Is the concept of justice invocable in the society that says we must do what we can to diminish that antipodes? We must pay more for the education of the child down in the southern region, even if it means diminishing the grant to the child in the upper region. Is this, as thus far described, a rough attempt at, quote, justice?
No. Morality is the difference between right and wrong in concrete, specific decisions and transactions between and among individuals. When this is elevated to a social plane, it ceases to have any particular recognizable content as justice.
But is that terminologically subjective? If an individual decides to give succor to a hungry person, why is that different from 10 individuals giving succor to 10 hungry people?
Oh, privately and individually?
No, even if you use the instrumentality of the tribe.
Because at that point I become the sucker for them because it's my taxes that accompany theirs. It's fine for you to decide to be charitable. It is not fine for you to be charitable with my resources as opposed to yours. In fact, there's no charity connected with them.
Well, this really depends on the rules of society, doesn't it?
Well, it raises the question, what is a society?
I'm acquainted with your essay that says that no such thing exists.
I mean, is the fact that the people of Oklahoma and the people of New York find it convenient to have a common system of law and of rules, a justification that the people of Oklahoma can demand that the people of New York, out of their pocket, assist the people of Oklahoma? I mean, it's a question which, once you ask it, you would agree there's nothing like a moral agreement which creates such a right. It's merely the fact, well, where there is the power, and once we have a common state there is the power, it is accepted as legitimate that this power takes out of the pockets of the rich and out of the... Now, does it mean that if we have a world government, we can tax the Americans to, all Americans, to 80% of their incomes in order to maintain the Chinese? I mean, that's the same principle applied. That once you have an international government, there would be the international power. You would have to claim that it is perfectly legitimate if that international government decides to tax all Americans to 80% of their income, hand it over to the Chinese, and feed the Chinese. Whatever we may think about desirable future rules of morals, there's no doubt that the existing rules of morals do not justify this. And I would maintain that, in fact, when today the wealthy parts of the United States are heavily taxed in favor of the poorer parts, this is not the result of any moral agreement of the majority of the American people, but solely the effect that whatever party is in power needs the woods of Oklahoma and pays for the woods of Oklahoma at the cost of the people of the wealthier parts, nothing else.
Well, but the motivations of the people who pass those laws are not necessarily the motivations of people who are propelled by demagogic pressure, are they? You're not denying disinterested generosity exercised in the legislature, are you?
It's an entirely different matter. Disinterested generosity determines voluntary action. But to claim that there is a consensus of the American people which authorizes the legislature to bring about a certain redistribution of income is in fact not true. The American people have never asked about the principles that ought to be applied in this. All they are told is that in fact the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, who promises you such and such, will be in power only if it buys the support of the people in Oklahoma. And since you know that you will get from the Democratic Party only what you expect from it, you vote from it, and you take into account the necessity in order that the Democratic Party gets into power, it has to pay special benefits to the people of Oklahoma. That's what it comes to.
Our examiner today is Mr. Jeff Greenfield.
Is your skepticism about social justice confined to the sphere of economics, or are you skeptical about any ability to define it?
Classical demand is that the state ought to treat all people equally, in spite of the fact that they are very unequal. You can't deduce from this the rule that because people are unequal, he ought to treat them unequally in order to make them equal. And that's what social justice amounts to. It's a demand that the state should treat the different people differently in order to place them in the same position. The rule of equal treatment applies only to things the state has to do in any case. But to making people equal a goal of governmental policy would force government to treat people very unequally indeed.